Help me hit 7,000 subscribers. Support the video with a like and share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. Thank you. I've always been the social one. The one who keeps conversations alive at dinner tables, who makes friends in checkout lines, who fills the silence when others let it breathe. My husband, Daniel, was the opposite. Quiet, thoughtful, never rushing to speak unless he had something worth saying. Some people found it mysterious. Most just found it awkward. When we got married, even my family joked about it. Does he ever talk? My brother laughed during his toast. I laughed too, pretending I didn't feel that sharp twist in my chest. Daniel smiled, that small, knowing smile of his. He didn't defend himself, didn't explain. He just raised his glass and said softly, "To patience, it's the quiet moments that tell the truth." People chuckled, thinking it was cute. But I remember thinking, patience? What's that supposed to mean? As years went by, those jokes didn't stop. They evolved. At dinner parties, my friends would tease, "Maya, does Daniel even exist, or did you marry a ghost?" When he'd offer a comment, slow, deliberate, someone would always smirk. "Oh look, he speaks." I'd laugh with them. Every single time. Not because I thought it was funny, but because I didn't want to look like the overly sensitive wife defending her quiet husband. But over time, something started to change. Daniel didn't stop showing up to social events. He just withdrew from the conversation. He'd sit there, polite, listening, his eyes calm and distant. Sometimes he'd rest his hand on my shoulder under the table, almost like he was grounding me. But I was too busy keeping everyone entertained to notice the way he was fading from the edges of our life together. One night, at a small gathering with my coworkers, the jokes turned cruel. It started with harmless teasing, but soon someone, half drunk, said, "Daniel's the kind of man you'd forget was even in the room. No wonder Maya does all the talking, she's married to a shadow." The room erupted in laughter. I remember freezing, a glass of wine halfway to my lips. And I did nothing. I didn't defend him. I just smiled. That strained, brittle kind of smile people wear when they're terrified of standing out. Daniel didn't say a word. He just looked at me, not angry, not hurt, just quietly observing. And somehow, that silence felt louder than the laughter. The next morning he made breakfast like always. Eggs, toast, coffee, everything perfectly normal. But there was something about the way he set my plate down that felt final. I asked, "You're quiet today." He smiled faintly. "You didn't notice, Maya, but I've been quiet for years." That line stayed with me all day. For the first time I started watching him. The way he'd wait for people to finish speaking before adding his thoughts. The way his words were always few but meaningful. And the way people, especially me, never really listened. Weeks passed. One evening, my parents invited us to dinner. My dad, who had always adored Daniel but never understood him, started reminiscing about our wedding. "Remember when everyone thought he was mute?" he laughed. "You could have married a mannequin and gotten more conversation." Everyone laughed again. The same laughter years later. Familiar, sharp, dismissive. And then Daniel finally looked up from his plate. Calm, steady, utterly unbothered. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even frown. He simply said one sentence that made the entire table fall silent. Daniel put down his fork gently, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and looked at my father with that same quiet steadiness he always carried. Then he said, "It's strange, isn't it? The loudest people often have the least to say, and the quiet ones spend their lives cleaning up the noise." The laughter died mid-breath. You could have heard a pin drop. My mother froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. My brother's smirk collapsed into an awkward silence. Even I sat there speechless. Daniel didn't sound angry. Not even slightly. His tone was calm, measured, almost kind. And that made it hit harder. He wasn't trying to win an argument. He was simply stating a truth no one wanted to face. After a moment, he pushed his chair back slightly. "I've never minded the jokes," he said. "What I mind is that silence is mistaken for emptiness. It's not. It's observation. And sometimes, what we observe tells us more about people than what they say. Then he smiled, small, soft, and continued eating like nothing happened. The rest of the meal was quiet. Too quiet. My father cleared his throat a few times, trying to find a new topic, but the air had shifted. Every word felt heavy, like it was being weighed before it left anyone's lips. When we got home, I didn't know what to say. I wanted to apologize, but for what? For laughing with them. For not stopping them. For only realizing now that he'd been hurt all along. He washed the dishes in silence while I just stood there, watching him. Finally I whispered, "You embarrassed them." He glanced at me, drying his hands with a towel. "No," he said quietly. "They embarrassed themselves. I just stopped helping them hide it." That night, lying beside him, I stared at the ceiling and thought about all the times I'd laughed at his expense. All the times I'd mistaken stillness for weakness. I'd wanted him to be more like me, social, expressive, loud, because I thought that made me confident. But Daniel's calm wasn't shyness. It was strength disguised as quiet. The next week at work, I found myself pausing before I spoke. I noticed how people filled silences with meaningless chatter just to avoid discomfort. I saw how often laughter was used as a shield, not joy. And suddenly I understood him. A few nights later we had friends over again, the same circle that used to make him the punchline. Midway through the evening, one of them tried to make a familiar joke. "Come on, Daniel, say something before we forget your voice." Everyone chuckled nervously, waiting for him to react. But this time I spoke before he could. "Careful," I said, smiling politely. "He tends to speak only when it matters. You might not like what you hear." The laughter stopped again, just like that night at my parents'. But Daniel's eyes met mine, and for the first time in a long time he looked proud. Not because I defended him, but because I'd finally understood him. After they left, I asked him, "Did it ever bother you? The jokes?" He thought for a moment. "It used to," he admitted. "Until I realized that when people mock what they don't understand, it's not about you. It's about them trying to silence what makes them uncomfortable." He turned to me, that gentle warmth in his eyes. "You used to be uncomfortable with silence too." I smiled faintly. "Not anymore." He reached out, took my hand and said, "Then you finally started listening." It wasn't dramatic or romantic. It was just honest. And somehow, that honesty filled the quiet more than any laughter ever had. Over time I noticed the change in myself. I didn't rush to fill the pauses in conversations. I didn't need to prove how interesting I was. I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say nothing, to let silence reveal who's really comfortable with themselves and who's terrified of being unseen. People still talk too loud, still make jokes that aren't kind. But now I catch myself smiling when they do. Not out of anger, not out of superiority, but because I finally understand what Daniel's patience meant that night when he raised his glass years ago and said, "It's the quiet moments that tell the truth." He was right. They do. And that one calm sentence, the one that silenced everyone, didn't just shock the room. Changed the way I listen, the way I love, and the way I measure strength. Because sometimes the bravest voice in the room is the one that doesn't need to shout.